Hello everyone, welcome to Equip Kingdom. This is where we come together every week to dig deep into God's Word, to learn about who He is, who we are in Jesus, and how we live in His kingdom. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be finishing chapter 5 of Mark. That's going to be verses 21 to 43. Let's bow our heads in prayer so we can get going. Heavenly Father, I look to you as our healer, as our Savior, as our grace, as our mighty one who goes before us and does all things for us. Father, I ask that you bless the hearing and the reading of this word so that it gives us fresh eyes to see your glory and to give you all praise and glory. And it's in the mighty name of Jesus that we lift you up and we revel in you. Amen. So last time if you were with us, you saw that Jesus had demonstrated absolute sovereignty over both nature in the storms, the wind and the waves, and also over some very powerful demons. And Jesus has shown us that no matter how ferocious the storm, an internal or external storm, however that rages in our lives, that He is with us, that He is enough, He goes before us, and He fights on our behalf, He intercedes for us. And so He ensures that we are more than conquerors through Him, right? Because He is the one who makes all things submit to Him in His glory and His sovereign power. And then we left off with the townspeople of Gergesa rejecting Jesus and begging Him to leave, which He graciously does. And this is where we start our study time today. We're going to go ahead and pick up in Mark 5. We're going to be reading verses 21 to 24. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around Him while He was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at His feet. He pleaded earnestly with Him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around Him. Unlike the earlier journey to the eastern side of the lake, the trip back to Capernaum is uneventful, and I'm sure the disciples are quite pleased about that. I say that Jesus and His disciples returned to Capernaum, but we're really not told this outright by Mark. This account also shows up in both Matthew and Luke, and we know from the three accounts we can piece together that it's likely Capernaum that they journey to. Mark, as we've just read, doesn't really give us any indication, only that Jesus and His disciples have crossed back to the other side of the lake. Matthew 9 puts this encounter with Jairus in a slightly different setting. It's after Jesus calls Matthew to be one of His disciples, and then later Jesus is confronted by people who want to know why His disciples don't fast like John the Baptizer's and the Pharisees' disciples do. And since those events take place in Capernaum, we can assume that this is also in Capernaum. So Luke tells us in Luke 8 verse 40 that Jesus has just returned after freeing the demoniac, defeating the demon, freeing the demoniac, and it's that word return that again points us back to Capernaum. Because it's largely believed that Capernaum is the base of operations for Jesus's Galilean ministry. It's where Peter's house is, right? So we see this contrast between the two different receptions for Jesus. Jesus is rejected by a community of pig herders, and now He returns to a crowd where they're waiting for Him in full anticipation of His mercy and compassion. And among these people is Jairus. And Mark describes Jairus as one of the synagogue leaders. And it's actually interesting that Mark names Jairus, since it's really not something that Mark does in his gospel. Those just aren't the kinds of details he tends to include. And this again points to Capernaum, because Jairus is named, it's likely that Peter, who of course we know is the source of Mark's gospel, right? Peter likely knows Jairus, right? And if Peter knows Jairus, that means they probably are from the same place, and that's Capernaum. Remember, we talked about how Peter's house could just be steps away from the synagogue. So Jairus is likely the president of the synagogue. The leaders of synagogues were not priests, they weren't scribes of the law, but they were instead laymen who gave generously to the synagogues. So they were like patrons of sorts as to how they got the position. They were given administrative authority over the synagogue, And if you were to kind of make them similar to church assignments that exist today, they'd be very similar to, say, an operations pastor or an executive pastor in what they oversaw. So they oversaw both the maintenance and the security of the synagogues. They were in charge of procuring scrolls for the scripture readings. They selected men and invited men to come and present readings for service. Remember, Jesus is chosen quite often. The reading from the Torah, or the law, was scheduled by the synagogue leader, by the president, and then the invited speaker would choose a complementary passage from one of the prophets and then explain how the two passages work together. Now, historical accounts from this time period show that there was actually considerable diversity in the selection of presidents of synagogues, and included men who had Greek heritage, they had Greek last names, women were chosen, and even children. So that goes to show you that it really was an honorary with duties as assigned, right? Now, we know from all four gospel accounts that Jesus is regularly chosen to speak in the synagogues, including at Capernaum. And it seems quite likely then that Jairus also knows Jesus. Jairus at this point is desperate. His disposition, it's really an important detail in this story, since we do see it in another person whom Jesus is about to meet. Matthew tells us that Jairus assumes a position of worship before Jesus, while both Mark and Luke instead paint a picture more of Jairus' desperation, saying in both cases that he has fallen to his knees before Jesus. He's at his end, right? He's at the end of himself and all that he can do. Jairus pleads with Jesus to help his daughter, who's dying. The Greek idiom here that's used here is at death's door. If you remember from our study in Matthew 9, by the time Jesus disembarks from the boat, Jairus' daughter has already died. And whatever her state, whichever one it actually was, Jairus is fully confident that Jesus will have the power and authority to help his daughter. And Jesus, of course, does agree to go with Jairus to his house to help her. And we're reminded of similar stories in the Old Testament of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, who come to revive children of parents who are desperate for their help. Like Elisha revives the Shunammite's son in 2 Kings 4, verses 32 to 37. It's a great story. Go check it out. Now, Mark includes another important detail about Jesus as he's heading towards Jairus' home. The large crowd goes with Jesus and surrounds him, pressing in all around him. And this reminds us once again that the crowd often serves as a barrier to Jesus' ministry. And it also sets us up for witnessing just the incredible awareness that Jesus has for one person among many who stand out because of her desperation and her faith. Mark then tells of an interruption to Jesus' journey in Mark 5, verses 25 to 34. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Okay, so this is another one of those stories where Mark interrupts his main story by inserting another story that is on the face of it unrelated, but they really do complement one another to tell a bigger theme, right? That sandwich technique that I've mentioned a few times. In this case, there's a woman who's been suffering from constant blood flow for 12 years. And although none of the gospel accounts state this outright, it is assumed that the woman has a condition that has caused a continual menstrual flow for the past 12 years. Okay, you can well imagine that she has dealt with several physiological concerns that would stem from this condition, and she suffered far more than just her physical ailments. In fact, in the Greek, Mark uses here in verse 29 a word to describe her condition, mastix, which literally means a whip or a scourge, a torture that's been believed to have been sent by God to discipline or punish someone. So she's being continually tortured by this. Now, Leviticus 15, verses 25 to 27, gives us a sense of what this woman's life has been like for the last 12 years. Let's take a look at those verses. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. She was unclean for 12 years, right? So she was isolated from society for 12 years. Anywhere that she sat or laid down became unclean, which meant she wasn't welcomed in people's homes. Intimate relationships with men would make them unclean, which meant she likely was unable to marry or have children, assuming she wasn't married when all this happened. I do believe this would have been cause for a husband to divorce, right, if she wasn't able to have children because of this. The historian Josephus tells us that women were banished from the temple during their menstrual cycle, which means this woman hadn't been allowed into the temple or even into the temple courtyard, the women's courtyard, for over 12 years. Okay, so we can see that her uncleanness, it transferred to anyone who came into contact with her or even her clothing. So no one would go near her. Can you imagine how lonely and rejected this woman was? How all she could know was people running away from her or whispering about her or just sneering at her, turning away from her? This poor woman. On top of all that, there is in fact physical trauma that would stem from this, right? She obviously would have been fatigued often because of her anemia, right? That blood loss. And the worst part about it, in my opinion, is that she's introduced to us not by any name at all, but solely by her uncleanness, just like that man with the skin defilement, right? Earlier in Mark 2. That's her sole identity in society. Oh, I think it's Mark 1, actually. That is her sole identity in society, the unclean woman who hemorrhages blood. That's it. That's what she's known by. Not exactly what you want to be known for in society, especially a tight-knit society like Jewish society is and was at that time. Now, Mark tells us that she had suffered under the care of many doctors, spending countless monies in search of a cure, and was, as a result, even worse off than before. According to the Talmud, the woman was considered a zabah, one with a discharge. And there's an entire tractate, there's an entire section of the Mishnah that is devoted solely to this issue. Jewish physicians in the 1st century ancient Near East developed really highly sophisticated, sensible approaches to physical illness, although there is an obvious influence born out of both Babylonian and Persian captivity, right? You can see it in some of the things that they prescribe. Because Jewish thought intertwined God as healer with scientific observation, there really is often a co-opting of both remedies and prayer, like they tended to go together. In addition, many physicians were also religious scholars, again reinforcing this link between God and natural remedies. They called themselves the tools of God, right? They were the ones who did God's will. According to this tractate that I mentioned regarding the unnatural discharge of blood in women, the following remedies are offered. One, they prescribed drinking a goblet of wine that contained a powder that compounded from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses. Second, they were offered doses of Persian onions cooked in wine and administered with a mystical chant for the woman to arise out of your flow of blood. There's that combination of the two, right? Applying sudden shock treatment to the woman. And I have to tell you, I spent a little bit of time thinking about how this could be possible. I'm a little baffled by the idea of any kind of electrical use. The only thing I could come up with was maybe she was subjected to being in, say, a body of water with an electric eel. Either that or the shock was more like constantly being startled, like we do with people who have hiccups. I don't know. And the last one that I read that applied to this was carrying the ash of an ostrich's egg in a certain type of cloth. So we see here really a mixture of herbal and folk magic and prayer at play, right? That's really what their medicine looked like. And none of it helps. And I thought about it. I could see where maybe rubber could be used as a coagulant for the blood. And alum is actually is used medicinally as an astringent to cleanse the body. But some of it seems really more superstitious than medicinal, in my humble opinion. Now, the woman's approach to Jesus is a measure of radical faith for sure, but it is tinged with superstition. She may be reflecting on one hand on God's words regarding the tzitzit or the tassels of Jesus' prayer shawl, which we read about in Numbers 15, verses 38 and 39. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lusts of your own hearts and eyes. So the blue tassels represent God's covenant promises and his relationship with his people. And so in this case, the woman could be reaching out to Jesus on the basis of God's faithfulness to protect his people, to care for them. The woman had also no doubt already heard that others had been healed by Jesus' touch. And so now Jesus is here in her sights, and she is determined, right, to get to him, to get past that shame, get past that stigma of her uncleanness and all the failed attempts that had come before to try and restore her health, and trust in Jesus. And that, my friends, is the mindset of a disciple. In this regard, she really is showing herself to be one who is positioning herself as a disciple would. And I think that's really attractive to God. But during this time, there's also a really pervasive belief among the peoples, and not just the Jewish people, but people in the ancient Near East, that touching the garments of famous and powerful people, it transferred part of their power and their presence onto the person who was touching the garment. And there are stories, and this is a few hundred years before, but there are stories of how Alexander the Great had been mobbed by people trying to touch his clothing or person to gain just some semblance of his power and presence. And of course, this mindset's a little bit more of a superstitious nature, and that could be a part of her radical faith that she's presenting now, right? That touching Jesus's shawl, touching his tzitzit, the tassels, his cloak, whatever you want to call it, would bestow some sort of mystical power of healing upon her. Given the remedies that she had been subjected to over the past 12 years, it is possible that she was taught to believe that there was mystical power in a holy man's garment, right? Especially a holy man like Jesus. When Jesus realizes that the power has gone out from him, he insists on connecting with the one who received his power through faith. And really, this release of power is evidence of God's gracious decision to release his healing power over her through her connection to Jesus. God is honoring her faith here, right? She's positioning herself as a disciple would, and God's honoring that. in light of all that she risked to walk out that faith. Seriously, right? If her actions, if touching Jesus's cloth, her clothing, cloak, seat, prayer shawl, whatever it is that she touches, if it had been unsuccessful, she could have been exposed to the mob as being present among them when she's supposed to be isolated for disobeying purity laws. What would they have done to her, right? When they realized that they had been exposed to her uncleanness, especially in such tight quarters, what might they have done to her? We don't know, because Jesus is there, and his faithfulness is there, and God's promise is there, and she's healed, as we know. Now, the disciples clearly do not grasp the significance of what has transpired between Jesus and this woman, right? They're so focused on where Jesus is supposed to go rather than who he is and what he's come to offer this world. And I'm reminded here of another story, again of Elisha, the prophet Elisha, where Elisha and his servant, they're surrounded by the enemy and all of their horses and all of their chariots, right? This is in 2 Kings 6, by the way. So his servant initially just sees the chariots and the horses, and he panics. And Elisha, instead, he prays to the Lord and says, he asks the Lord to open his servant's eyes so that he can see with God's perspective. And in this case, that there are many more angelic forces present than the horses and chariots that they've come to protect Elisha and his servant. As for the disciples, they have been given eyes to see, right? This kingdom perspective. But they're not yet mature enough to look primarily with their spiritual eyes. It's not a default for them yet. Now, by the time we get to the Acts of the Apostles, we really do see an amazing shift in the apostles' default perspective. But they're not there yet, right? So this is even more evidence that insiders versus the outsiders, right? The insiders to Jesus, they're privileged, right? They're not chosen because of what they bring to the table for Jesus. More than anything else in this situation, the disciples do here prove by their lack of understanding that God chooses people based on his graciousness and love rather than a person's performance or capacity. But Jesus fully understands not only that God has honored this woman's faith and how her faith will show Jairus, who's still with them, right? What it looks like to choose faith over circumstances, but also how this woman needs to be set free from any misconceptions about Jesus. And I think this is why Jesus tells her specifically that it's her faith that's healed her, right? Implying that it's not the mystical power of his clothing. And we see this play out in Matthew's gospel, actually quite a bit more, with the healing of the centurion's servant and also the two blind men, which actually follows the story in Matthew. In both encounters, Jesus commands that the healing will take place as their faith expects, right? Let's look at that language in Matthew 9, verse 29. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." Right? Healing happens through the expectation in faith of Jesus's power and intercession on our behalf. That's that connection between the two. Now, Jesus has done much more than just heal this woman physically. Her faith has healed her. The Greek word that's used for this is, of course, sozo. And sozo means much, much more than just the restoration of health. It means to make a person whole. And that includes salvation. There is a separate word for salvation, but sozo includes salvation within it. And for this woman, that assuredly also means a restoration of her peace, which Jesus mentions, right? Go in peace. And a freedom from the shame that she has suffered for 12 years, right? That's an old identity that he's setting her free from. And to top it all off, in light of that, she's no longer the woman with the bleeding issue. She's now a beloved daughter of God, as Jesus himself calls her daughter. And I'd also like to think that Jesus seeks her out because God promises to reveal himself to those who seek him, right? Those who seek him with all of their hearts. That's what we're doing here, right? And those who seek him, they'll find him. That's his promise. Jesus wants to connect with her because her faith has drawn her to the kingdom. Remember, she has that posture of a disciple. God is looking for people who are looking for him. The prophet Hanani tells King Asa in 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9 that the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. That's actually not what Asa wants to hear, by the way. It's not a compliment or an encouragement to Asa, but it does in fact contain a great promise to those who are seeking the Lord in order to connect with him. David, King David, he tells us that God is looking for people who understand his character and nature in Psalm 14, verse 2. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. David then shares part of that promise for seeking him in Psalm 34, verse 5. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. And of course, we know the prophet Jeremiah and his very well-known promise to the people who are living in exile, Jeremiah 29:11, right? God's plans for his people. It's followed actually by another promise to those who set their focus on God a couple verses later in Jeremiah 29, verses 13 and 14. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. All these apply here to this woman, right? Jesus is showing us that seeking out the woman who sought him with all of her heart, that he will reward our faith with himself and with the glory and salvation that comes with that relationship that's rooted in agape love, right? Agape love is selfless love, right? So one where you don't seek yourself, but instead are seeking God, that's also a form of agape love. And when you are seeking him with all of your heart, and he is willing to do anything to connect with you, there's a glory and a salvation that he promises as a result. More than anything else, I think that this woman longs to know and be known. And Jesus satisfies that longing as only he can. And in that way, I think we can all relate to this woman. I certainly can. Now, Christian tradition has a very interesting continuing story about this woman. She was given the Greek name of Berenice and later the Latin name of Veronica. The church historian Eusebius writes in the early 4th century that she came from Caesarea Philippi. He claims that there, just outside her home, is a copper statue of her kneeling, her hands outstretched towards a man who supposedly bears the physical likeness of Jesus. Supposedly, a strange herb wraps around the column that the statues stand upon, and this herb possesses a medicinal power to cure a great variety of diseases. Okay. I wasn't able to find any historical evidence of this. I don't know if it exists at all. But it is, in fact, a great example of how the early church would embellish upon the biblical stories to continue the miracle stories of Jesus, right? To continue on that story and keep the story of those people going so that Jesus's miracles lived on in other ways. Now, the woman's interruption and delaying of Jesus, it does initially appear to come at a cost. And we learn about this with Jairus' story once again in Mark 5. We're going to be looking in verses 35 to 40. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher any more? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, Don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. Okay, so this sets up a very interesting contrast and continues an interesting contrast from the woman's story as well, between facts and faith, right? And we see this play out throughout the story. The facts have shown that this little girl was dying and now has died. The facts have shown that every attempt by these physicians to heal this woman of her 12-year bleeding issue not only failed, but took all of her money and made her even worse off. Mark gives us the facts, and there are plenty of voices that assess the situation based on facts. And really, apart from Jesus, facts tend to be a very good predictor for coming to a logical conclusion. But here's the truth, right? Facts can change, but truth always stays the same. It never changes. And Jesus is the truth. He is the way, and he is the life, as he tells us in John 14, verse 6. Apart from Jesus, the girl can't be revived. Apart from Jesus, the woman won't be healed and freed from her suffering. But in Jesus, there is hope. And all that's required of us, just like with the woman and Jairus, is to believe in faith that all things are in fact possible through Jesus. So we see Jairus' people tell Jairus that it's in no use at all in bringing Jesus to the house. It's too late. And Jesus' response is described in the NIV as overhearing, but the Greek word that's used here is parakouo, and it has a double meaning. It can mean to overhear something that's not directly meant for your ears, but it can also mean to be unwilling to hear. In other words, to ignore or disregard or pay no attention to it whatsoever. And I think that the latter definition is actually more fitting in Jesus' character. I don't know if you agree with me, but it fits the situation certainly. He already knows what's going to happen. And so these people, however well-meaning they are, they don't know the truth. They're basing these things on facts. And right now, facts are going to serve as a stumbling block to Jairus' faith. And Jairus must have faith that all things are possible with Jesus. And that's what the woman with the bleeding issue, that's that interruption, what she's supposed to show Jairus, right? That radical faith can draw God's power into the situation where otherwise it's hopeless. One more point about Jesus' encouragement to Jairus to just believe. It's an imperative. We've talked about this before, which tells us that Jesus is telling Jairus to not only believe, but to keep believing. It's a mindset of belief, a posture of faith to keep him from despairing. Notice too that Jesus only permits his inner circle of disciples to accompany him with the parents into the house of Jairus. And I think this is probably the same mindset that Jesus uses in selecting these three that he does when he invites the three to witness his transfiguration on Mount Hermon, right? Jesus likely finds them trustworthy, that he can show them more about his identity and purpose that maybe the others just aren't ready for yet. But I also think that Jesus wants to limit how many people see this miracle. And just because he's able to do so, I wonder if he hasn't looked into the hearts of all those who were present and determined that only these 5 people would be able to honor his desire to keep the details private, at least at this point. Now, we certainly see a group that is not worthy to be present at this time, and those are the mourners, who Mark tells us laugh at Jesus. Now, professional mourners, they were required at all funerals, where even the poorest families were required by Jewish law to have hired no less than 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman, okay, right, in order to mourn their deceased relative. It was a requirement under Jewish law, not God's law, Jewish law. Well, Jairus is not poor, so his very position as president of the synagogue, it really does show us that he's likely to be quite well off. So there are likely dozens of wailing women and women clapping their hands and singing dirges and wailing loudly. There's probably dozens of them present. And it's interesting, most of these professional mourners were women. So a bunch of wailing women all together in a room, crying, clapping their hands, woe is me. Yeah, I don't think I'd want them present either. I'm just saying. Okay, these mourners, they know the facts, and the facts clearly show that the child has died. And I've already stated this, right? That the facts and those who present the facts at this point are only going to serve as a stumbling block to Jairus' faith. So Jesus questions them, right, on why they're carrying on so much and crying and wailing loudly. Jesus then makes a pretty counterintuitive statement that the girl is not dead, that she's only sleeping. This statement is somewhat ambiguous in Mark, since it can in fact be interpreted as Jesus diagnosing the child as maybe being in a coma or in a vegetative state of some sort rather than being dead. However, we do have Matthew's account, which says that Jesus had already, by the time Jesus had disembarked, the child had already died. And then we also have Luke, who is a physician by profession, as you may know, who describes the girl's spirit returning to her body by Jesus' touch in Luke 8, verse 55. And really that can only be interpreted as her being brought back to life, right? Her spirit being returned to her. So there are, in fact, several scriptures that describe death as sleeping or resting. What came to my mind very quickly were how all the kings of Judea and Israel were described when they were laid to rest, right? How they rested with their ancestors. The first one that I can remember we talk about is David's own funeral procession, or his own funeral, which we read about in 1 Kings 2:10. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. We also have David's Psalms to show us that ancient Jewish mindset that considered death as a kind of sleep in Psalm 13, verse 3. Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And those are both Old Testament verses, as you know, but that mindset was actually still apparently present during Jesus's time, because Paul encourages his believers to think of death in this way in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. It's an interesting perspective, don't you think? Our souls are eternal, but our bodies are given a period of rest until the trumpet sounds of Jesus' return. And that reminds me of how God required that the land rest every 7 years from being planted. And of course, how he commands us to devote ourselves to a Sabbath rest every 7 days. Something to meditate on, think about this whole idea of what death means to our bodies. Now, Jesus' response to the mourners mocking him is to put them out. The Greek definitely indicates that he does so with sovereign force. He casts them out. The Greek word is ekbalo, which you may remember is the same word that is used to describe how Jesus casts out demons from possessed people. These people are literally cast out like he would cast out a demon. Only then will Jesus restore the girl, as we then read in Mark 5, verses 41 to 43. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now we're going to see this same dynamic between Jesus and the mourners. We're going to see it play out a little differently, but the same dynamic next time when we begin Mark chapter 6. Because there Jesus is going to go to a place where very few people have faith in him. And as a consequence, he's unable to do very many miracles that we see him do throughout the rest of the Gospels. And that's really what these mourners represent and why they had to leave. Our faith is a conduit, okay? And our doubt's a barrier. Our faith is a conduit to the ways in which God really wants to reveal himself to a lost and dying world. And any doubt that we have serves as a barrier to that. And so we see that once again that Jesus is unconcerned with the impact of an unclean touch. In this case, the little girl's corpse. And we see this in all four Gospels, once again, that Jesus, he takes away the uncleanness of many that he touches, and he makes the disciples clean by his word, and that includes you and me. But no one is able to make him unclean by their touch. So Mark, he includes the Aramaic of what Jesus says here, along with the translation for his audience who wouldn't have understood Aramaic. And I think he does this to best illustrate the affection and the compassion of Jesus. The Aramaic talitha is actually the feminine form for youth, but also for lamb. And so Jesus is using a term of affection here. And it would have been lost in the Greek translation, which would have used the word choresion, right? Which is how Mark translates it. Little girl is choresion. Cum, of course, means to arise. So if you put these together, talitha cum, Jesus' very sweet words to this girl may have been, little lamb, wake up. And I really do picture Jesus kneeling beside this little girl and gently speaking to her while holding her hand. I see a very gentle interaction between the two of them. Yet at the same time, this is in fact a sovereign command of Jesus. And as we see, the little girl immediately complies, completely restored, right? Immediately she gets up and begins to walk around. And her parents and the disciples, they're unprepared for what they witness. And Mark tells us that they are completely astonished. And again, in the Greek, it gives us a much more vivid illustration of their reaction. Both words that are used here for completely and astounded, they both mean the same thing in Greek, that it was a mind-blowing experience for them. Like both words mean mind-blowing, that it was completely beyond their comprehension, and all they can do there is stand there dumbfounded in fear and awe. And then Jesus gives them two commands, the parents that is, to keep the details of what has happened secret and to give the little girl something to eat. And both of these things are very practical advice. Okay, so there's no way that they're going to be able to keep the little girl's revival secret. That's just unreasonable. People are going to learn pretty quickly that she is alive, and there are many who can testify that she's died. What Jesus is asking them to do is to keep his actions veiled, at least for the time being. And this is going to permit Jesus and his disciples the space that they're going to need to depart for Capernaum without the uproar that would certainly come with knowing what he did. As to the second command, to feed the girl, I think it's a testament to her being alive, and her death interrupted the family dynamic and the way that they were doing life. And this restarts that, right? It restarts that family life that was interrupted by her death. In other words, it's time once again for her to grow and for her parents to once again care for and nurture her, right? It's like, okay, it's go back to what you had been doing before. It's time. That's all of chapter 5 and all of our study time for today. Next time we're going to start Mark 6, of course, where Jesus is in a familiar place, where he is very well known, but he's little understood. And that makes all the difference in the world. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I hope that you enjoyed our time together. I hope that you learned something new. If anything, you probably learned a little bit about first century medicine, Jewish medicine, right? I hope that you're having a good and fruitful week. I hope that you are receiving fresh revelation from God. We're in a new year as far as God's calendar is concerned. And I hope that as we move into this new year, that there's a fruitfulness that you just haven't seen before that shows you just how loved you are, just how valued you are, just how cherished you are. And that when you step into all that God has for you in this coming year, that it is all that God dreamed for you, and that you are worthy because he called you to it. You are worthy because he dreamt it for you. I hope you take care. Know that I'm praying for you and that I love you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.